we want to, go to our next issue, and this is we're going to be joined by Mike
Wait,
Prysner in just a
I
bit,
have to
who
tell you.
is a oh,
Oh,
I'm sorry, I was gonna
but Mike,
oh,
can I
I
tell you
was
what my
actually trying to
segue was gonna
just
be for Mike?
please, oh my
You're trying to go
God,
past that. No, I have to. It was
go ahead.
because no, because this is funny. I promise. And if
Is
it's
it?
not,
Because when you have to say it's
it's
funny,
not
that usually, but go ahead.
because you were talking about harassment of people, like
Hmm.
legit harassment. And I was just thinking about the harassment of George W. Bush night after night. The poor man is just trying to get a speech out and he's constantly being reminded that he killed millions of people. I mean, it's just not right. It's harassment. It's bullying. It was
Wow,
someone
Rania.
that people tried to portray it that way. People did try to.
No,
That's why
people
I
did
thought it
try to
was
portray
funny.
it that way. Well, we want to bring Mike on, but I think we have a clip of what happened. I want to just actually play a little bit of that for context for those who may have missed it. I think it was a very important moment that took place there a couple days ago.
Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMD. A million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize.
Well, we're
So,
joined by the man
Eugene,
himself, Mike Prysner, friend of the show, producer for the Empire Files, Iraq War veteran, of course, also an organizer against the Iraq War for many years. It's actually how we know each other. Mike, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Happy to be back. Good joke,
Well,
Rania.
yeah,
I
thank you,
support
thank
your
you, thank
I
you.
support your
I
segue.
have
yeah.
I have to say, I hear people getting upset, but I thought it was excellent.
Well,
I just want
all
to
I
say
can
it
say
was
is this shows
excellent
that
and
Mike truly is a
clever.
good person with a kind heart, that he actually went with you on
No,
that one.
no, he agreed it was funny, but also can I tell you guys something, Mike? My first thought upon watching your video, okay, I watched it like 30 times because it was so satisfying and important what you did, but I just couldn't get past the people at the end. You see that row of people just like zombies. They like kind of look
Mhm.
as you're being taken out and like no expression on their face whatsoever. And then they look back kind of just satisfied that you've been removed from the crowd. So anyways, I just wanted to point that out to ask you, like, what was the feeling as you were being, do you even remember like the look on people's faces? Were they even receptive to what you were saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, funny enough, it's kind of like one of those blackout moments where I don't have a strong memory of what happened in the moment. I do remember that the security guards that dragged me out, though, as soon as we got out of the theater and I was no longer being a disturbance and they were just carrying me out, I said to them, I was like, that guy is bad, right? And they're like, oh yeah, no, we hate him. And so took me out very nicely. And then apparently the women that you see attacking me in the video were organized. They're the owner of the business that did the event. So they were very, very mad. But then they were apparently, after I left, my friend Marisa, who was filming, said that after I got kicked out, the women who attacked me were like yelling at the security guards, being like, why did you let him go? Why didn't you have him arrested? And so there was
Jesus.
some drama afterwards about the fact that I had some support from the security at the event, who just worked at the theater. I mean, they weren't like Bush's security or working for the company. It was just the venue security who, I think also agreed with what I was saying.
Yeah.
But definitely the
Well,
crowd was not.
no, well, I mean, if you're going to pay to see George Bush, I'm just going to assume you're a terrible person. It just seems like I'm going to let that one
Yeah.
ride. Why was it important for you to do this, Mike? I mean, I'm sure you do a lot of important work on a lot of different fronts. You could have probably been a million different places. Why was it important for you to be in that theater?
Yeah, I saw Bush was speaking in LA, and I thought that he didn't really do speaking events a lot, but I learned afterwards that he's done over 200 public speaking events since he left office, and his rate for speaking events is in the ballpark of $175,000, which means just in speaking fees alone, he's made around $35 million since leaving office. And so speaking at this event in Beverly Hills, of course, as soon as we saw he was speaking here and in Long Beach, and so, of course, we immediately called a demonstration to protest outside. And just out of curiosity, I looked at tickets to the event. And funny enough, there was a lot of tickets still available. Even when I was there, the event was like 75% capacity. I mean, even getting $175,000 honorarium, that's obscene. But for ex-presidents like Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, they get like $700,000 per speaking event. So Bush is still very much in kind of like a D-list ex-president category. The events were not sold out. And so when I saw that there were seats available, even though they were quite expensive, I mean, my ticket, I spent over $1,000 to be able to get into the event. But I think the reason that I did it is because I felt it wasn't enough to protest outside. I felt like a deep responsibility to Iraqi people, to the myriad of communities that were affected by Bush, from Muslims in the United States, survivors of Katrina, people in Afghanistan, of course, people in Iraq, most of whom, all of whom suffered at Bush's hand, and to the many of families and friends that I've made along the way in the anti-war struggle. Families that have lost loved ones in combat in Iraq, to suicide, to drug overdose, to war wounds that they died from years after returning. Many people who I knew in the anti-war struggle. When I reference my friends are dead because you lied. I was lucky enough that none of my friends were killed in Iraq when I was there. Of course, many of my friends were wounded and had serious psychological issues that I've been, trying to help them through for the many years after the war. But, many people who I became close with and became friends and colleagues with, returning and becoming active in the anti-war struggle, they died from the Iraq war, from other types of things. The one name that I got to read, because I had a list of names of Americans and Iraqis who died in Bush's war. The one name I got to read, I thought was a good example. It's someone named Joshua Castile. He was in the first year of the Iraq war like myself. Him and I were on the same panel together at the Winter Soldier hearings. He became a conscientious objector and got himself kicked out of the army for refusing to go back to Iraq. But he died in 2012 of an aggressive brain cancer that he got from burn pits. Why did he get brain cancer from burn pits? Because not only did George Bush lie us into a war and cause all these people to die based on a lie, but he also turned the Iraq war into a money-making operation. So he gave contracts to companies like Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root to do things like trash disposal, which of course was doing as much profit maximization as possible. So they burned all this trash with high temperature fuel, which was completely knowingly a deadly, toxic thing to do. And it was all US soldiers and Iraqis living nearby who breathed in all the fumes. And it was so bad that actually more veterans are going to die from burn pit exposure than all of the veterans who were killed in combat, or all the soldiers who were killed in combat combined. And the reason I'm happy I got to read Joshua Castile's name is because I want people to learn his story. But just before his death, when he knew that his time was over, he said something that I found very powerful. He said, he was asked how he felt about his illness and dying from burn pits from Bush's war. And he said, I actually feel grateful. He said, I feel grateful that I get to share in the suffering of the Iraqi people who are far more exposed to this smoke and will have to be on their deathbed in a much less comfortable situation than I was. So that kind of solidarity that he felt with the suffering of the Iraqis brought on by Bush. And so it was people like him, other friends that we lost along the way, people like Thomas Young, people like Jacob David George, others who dedicated themselves to anti-war struggle after returning from the war, who then ended up succumbing to the wounds that they incurred there. So the responsibility I felt to those people, and of course, to the millions of Iraqis whose life had been totally shredded and destroyed by the war and continue to live in that nightmare, I felt I had no other choice but to do what I did.
Mm-hmm.
I also appreciate that you did mention Iraqis, because so often when we talk about the consequences of these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in the mainstream, they're always left out. And Iraq is, of course, as we all know, still dealing with the consequences of just a completely shattered country that's been drained of all of its professionals and most of its resources, and has just an extremely corrupt government that America set up for them. But all that said, I couldn't help but notice that, 2 nights in a row, George W. Bush gave a speech where he was paid very handsomely, despite being, like you said, a D-list ex-president. You interrupted on one night, and then the next night he was interrupted by Jeb Sprague, our friend and researcher, whose cousin is still suffering consequences from having served in Iraq. Of course, that that there isn't video of that, except there is video of George Bush reacting to it on stage. But I couldn't help but notice that it was ignored. I mean, it seems like a pretty big deal if night after night a former president is being heckled over allying us into war. I mean, what do you think that's about? Like, why did the media just not pay any attention? I mean, they usually like spectacle. This was spectacle. So where was the media on this? I mean, I know you've been asked to come in and give some interviews, but also like, what's that been like? Where have you gone on to
Sure.
interview? Are you getting a lot of phone calls?
Yeah, to be honest, none from the mainstream media at all. I
Mm.
think Al Jazeera is like the most mainstream outlet. I know BBC Arabic aired it and aired also Jeb Sprague's disruption the next day, which I will say I almost like it better to see Bush's face during the disruption than the person that's disrupting. I think that was actually kind of more illuminating to see Bush's reaction of like laughing and smiling and waving as this man recounted how his family was impacted by his war. But I think the reason that mainstream media hasn't really covered it so far, I mean, who knows? I mean, it's still getting out there in a big way. But I think it's because this in the immediate aftermath of a presidency, of course, it's easy to reject a president. Like if you remember back to the 2008 Republican National Convention, Bush couldn't speak at it. I mean, he was even toxic to his own party. So in the immediate aftermath of a presidency, you see if they were a bad president, like Trump is experiencing now, you see the kind of that's not who we are. We are this new face. But the entire institution of the presidency itself is something that the mainstream media and those that want to project this idea of stability and strength as a country or whatever, the lauding of ex-presidents is something that is like required. And so the rehabilitation of Bush wasn't just because people just came around and said, oh, you know what, actually, he wasn't so bad because Trump was worse. It's important for the system of imperialism and capitalism to say we have this great political system. And even if we have disagreements between these two parties, as a whole, the institution is good and it's strong. And so they needed to rehabilitate Bush to not, be embarrassed as a country and as a capitalist institution. And so that's what the effort has been. And so to cover what I did would then have to bring all those questions back about the entire Bush era, all of the wars that we are still living in the wake of. And that's a difficult thing for this system and this establishment to want to highlight. Of course, they don't want to highlight because it's a major blight on their record.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point, and I mean, it just seems like so much of this as well in the context of this, and one of the reasons I was actually very glad to see what happened, in terms of what you did, what Jeb did. Also, want to just connect this to an earlier story we talked about Haiti. Jeb Sprague has done a lot of great work on Haiti, and so definitely check him out on that earlier issue as well for those who were with us earlier in the show. But one of the things that I thought was important to me about this, Mike, is that there's been this sort of Bush rehabilitation issue around Trump. And it's sort of, people basically saying, well, Bush really wasn't that bad. We've seen every neocon revive themselves as, a liberal hero because they were against Trump. I mean, I won't even go down the laundry list of terrible people. And I thought that this was such an important just re-injection and reminder for people, especially younger people who do remember the terribleness of Trump, but not Bush, and forget what really happened, but really just sort of an important disruption of this sort of narrative change of Bush into some sort of, and this goes back, the Michelle Obama giving him the throat lozenge and all that kind of stuff. This rehabilitation of Bush is somehow, I don't know, almost like some sort of progressive or something like that, the way some people would talk about him.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very deliberate campaign. I mean, doing the rounds on different talk shows like Jimmy Kimmel and Ellen and so forth. I think that what's been encouraging to me in the reaction to this, I mean, number one, to see it go viral among Iraqi people was, of course, the most meaningful. I mean, I would be very understanding if I was rejected by that community, having been an occupying soldier in Iraq. But the fact that so many Iraqis, including the man who threw his shoes at Bush, has reached out to me and is very supportive. That, of course, means the world to me, and was the most heartening thing out of the whole thing. But the fact that it's so popular among young people, like high school age people, I mean, people that were not alive or were babies when Bush was doing the things that he was doing. And I think it is I think the popularity of the thing, partially it is like a hatred of Bush. And those of us who have such a deep memory of the Bush wars and the torture program and all of those things, it's satisfying to see someone say to his face what all of us like wish we could say to his face. Like, you need to beg for your forgiveness at the very least. But I think that on the other hand, the other reason that it's popular, especially with people who don't have much of a memory of Bush, is a desire for militancy and militant action. And it doesn't have to be about Bush. I mean, there's so many problems that we're dealing with as a country. I mean, from the pandemic, the economic crisis, eviction crisis, like access to a decent life, the kind of state of forever war, even though Biden just stood before the UN General Assembly and said for the first time in 20 years, we're no longer at war, yet we are waging war across the Middle East, Africa, and so forth. I think that people see that there are problems. And to see that and the support for an action that is militant, small action, I think it was empowering for people because, I didn't do that action by myself. I had my friend, my comrade Marisa with me, who was filming and who was fully expecting to get arrested at the action. And then there was dozens of people outside the event in support, holding a protest, who were prepared to run jail logistics in the event that we were arrested, which we expected. But it was still a small number of people. A less than a dozen people organized an action that was able to have national and international significance. And I think that the message that sends is that we don't need to have thousands and thousands of people in the streets to be effective. Of course, that helps, but you don't need it to be effective. And that people want militant confrontational action that fights for the values that we believe in. And so my hope is that resonance that it has for that reason can be an inspiration for other similar things to happen against Bush, but also others that we need to fight.
Yeah, I mean,
these
sorry.
people shouldn't be. Somebody got angry about
someone
Bush.
Dropped something and caught me off guard
Somebody.
there.
No, I think that's a really good point
here
though, because
in the Breakthrough News studio.
These people should not be able to walk around and live life comfortably as though they are totally normal. These are like sociopathic war criminals who are responsible not just for the destruction of Iraq. They're responsible for destruction of countries and the killings and murders of people all around the world in ways that, people can't even fathom. And so I think there's, along with like the desire for militancy, which I think you're absolutely right about, I think there's also like a real satisfaction people have, especially like Iraqis for one, but just in general, people, they take satisfaction in seeing what feels like somebody getting told to their face. It's like at the very least, that should be happening on a regular basis to people like George W. Bush, to people like Donald Rumsfeld, to this entire cabal of psychopaths that literally like it's like what they did to the Middle East was the equivalent of taking an asteroid and just like throwing it at Earth, but like at a region and just completely destroying it. Like they brought about an entire new era. And the Middle East is still suffering from the ramifications of right now. And so, I mean, that's more of a comment of gratitude, because I think what you did, like, it is so important and it needs to be done more often. It needs to be done all the time, because unfortunately, these people are probably never going to see the inside of a jail cell, which is where they should be.
Yeah, and I like the cryon cuddly war criminal Bush. I think that his image of just this like bumbling old fool who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and made some mistakes and is actually like personally like a lovable character. I mean, that's the kind of the way they've tried to rehabilitate him. But I think it's important, and this is why I included this in my disruption, for people to remember that these were very malicious lies. I mean, this wasn't a mistake. Yep. This wasn't a misstep. When you take so-called facts, when you take pieces of intelligence that you tell the world, and especially the country, that we have to invade Iraq because they have WMDs, knowing that that's a lie, and that if we don't act now, immediately, this was the line, the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud.
Yep.
So what Bush was saying to the country was, Iraq has these weapons, we know that for a fact, and if we do not invade them now, right now, they are going to launch an attack that kills millions of Americans. That was a lie. All of them knew it was a lie. They knew the intelligence was fake. They knew they were not going to find any WMDs. They knew that was a lie. You don't call that a mistake. You call that a conspiracy to commit a crime, because conspiracy to commit murder. And that's why even if he can take this image of this, like, whatever guy, silly, cuddly guy, that's actually what he really did. And I think another reason it resonates is because, I mean, this guy, not only did he face no consequences, he has a very good and lucrative post-presidency career. Speaking engagements aside, the 35 million aside that he's made, he sells, the fact that he sells books of paintings of soldiers who died in Iraq, which is just like, I couldn't even believe that was real when I heard it. It was just like, is this someone made this up, right? Someone had to have made this up. But it's real. He also, he owns a tree farm in Texas, like hundreds of acres of trees that he sells. He's like a tree salesman. So it's like weird stuff like this, where it's like he has so many millions of dollars that were made off of his popularity as this person. And I think that of course, he's probably never going to see the inside of a jail cell unless we have a revolution, which, hopefully can happen in his lifetime. But I think that just the idea that for him to not be able to show his face, and the justification for going and disrupting every time he speaks, and the message that I was trying to send was, at the very least, when you've done something wrong, when there's been an injustice, how do you repair that injustice? There is atonement and healing. And how do you have that? You have to have admissions that you did something wrong, apologies to the people that you hurt. I mean, that's a good starting point. And at the very least, Bush could do that. At the very least, Bush could admit, confess, I lied. I went off fabricated intelligence when I knew it was. I know that so many families have been destroyed and ripped apart by it. And I'm sorry. And that's, I was inspired to say that by Thomas Young, who was a soldier who was shot and paralyzed in Iraq. And he spent the rest of his life basically hounding Bush, like trying to demand that Bush meet with him and see the reality of what Bush's war did to people, young men like Thomas Young. And on his deathbed, right before he died of his complications from his injuries in Iraq, he said, "I hope before your time on earth ends, you have the moral courage to stand before the world and especially the Iraqi people and beg for your forgiveness." And so I wanted to relay that message from Thomas Young to Bush, because I think, that's a pretty good starting point for him to start to begin the process of healing that so many people need.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate, what you did. And also shout out to Jeb Sprague, friend of the show, also who disrupted the next night in Long Beach. Mike Prysner, producer for the Empire Files. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.